So the way you see the world is actually the way the world is. It sounds like quite an interesting statement, or it's an interesting way. I was reading a book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, and he gives an example of this very early on in the chapters. It was a Sunday morning, and he was on the bus, and it was a nice peaceful journey, and everyone was reading their newspapers or having a little very quiet chin wag with people next to them, their passengers. And all of a sudden a man came on with his 2 children, and the man happened to sit next to Stephen Covey. And the children, clearly the man couldn't control the children, because the children were running around everywhere and they were disturbing people's newspapers, and it just really creating a bit of a scene. You could tell people on the atmosphere on the bus had changed. That peacefulness had gone, and people were starting to tut, and people were starting to get a bit annoyed and irate. And Stephen Covey, because the man was the father, he was about to turn around to the man, or he turned around to the man, and he was about to say, what's going on, what's happening. So he said to the man, "So are you okay?" About to go into this whole, what's wrong with your children? Why can't you control your children? And the man looks up from his slumber, and he looks around at Stephen Covey, and he said, "I've just come back from the hospital, and my wife's just died, and I don't know how to tell the children." Now, in that moment, Stephen Covey's mindset changed. What he called a paradigm shift. The way he was looking at the scenario just totally changed on its head. He stopped being annoyed, and all he felt was overcome with love and compassion for this man. Sharing his grief, because obviously for a partner to pass away, and that's why the children were behaving in that way. Now, the scenario was the scenario, but how he looked at the scenario changed it. And that is an incredibly important thing for us to realize, that the world is the way the world is. But how we approach the world, how we see the world, is actually how we relate to the world, is actually how we see the world. So if you think about it, right, you have maps, you have different maps for the land. So for example, I live in Bolton at the moment, so in Bolton you have a road map. Google has road maps, for example. And then you have traffic maps. So you have like green and red depending on how fast the traffic is traveling on roads. Then you might have a map, like a terrain map, where you might have heights, how high the land is at, etc., and how low, below sea level and above sea level different places are at. You may even have a map of rural or urban or extra urban areas, etc. Now these maps are representations of how the world actually is, right? The land is, the city is, etc. Now, we all have these different maps or different paradigms of how we see the world inside ourselves. We have road maps and terrain maps, but they are the way we've been brought up. So for as something that influences us into how we see the world. Or we have cultural maps, perhaps they relate to how we see the world. Or we have maps of childhood experiences, again they influence how we see the world. So for example, let's say you had an upbringing where things were very negative, that you had an alcoholic father or an alcoholic mother, or drug abuse, or your friends were into drug abuse, or someone passed away early, etc. So you had quite a traumatic childhood. That might influence how you see the world. So now when you look at the world, things end up being a bit more negative, or maybe not so positive, or not so optimistic, etc. Maybe you had a very good upbringing. Maybe you had a lot of money in your house, and so the way you see the world changes again. So we all have these different ways of looking at the world. The world is the way it is. You can change the world, but the world is the way it is. But how you see the world can change. There is an ability to change that. So imagine you put on spectacles that were green, like green lensed spectacles. Everywhere you would look would be green. If you put on red lensed spectacles, everywhere you look would be red. The world isn't red. The way you're looking at the world through those spectacles is what's actually red. So you can choose what spectacles you put on. So if you put on the spectacles of negativity, you're going to see everything negative around you. If you put on the spectacles of positivity or optimism, everything around you will be optimistic. The way the world is the way the world is. You can't change that. But your approach, the way you can look at the world, that can change. There's an expression that the world is perfect. The flaw lies within. So if we change ourselves, if we change the approach, the way we look at things, that starts to change the way the world is and how we relate to the world. And that in itself can be an incredibly powerful concept.